The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the world into a cold, relentless blur of gray. Inside the cramped minivan parked behind the shuttered grocery store, Sarah Mitchell sat with her back pressed against the driver's seat, watching her 6-year-old twin sleep beneath a pile of donated blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's life. The windows fogged with their breath, creating a fragile barrier between them and the world outside that had decided they didn't belong anywhere. Emma slept, curled into a tight ball, her small hands tucked under her chin, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Beside her, Ethan rocked slightly even in sleep, his fingers tapping against the worn fabric of his jacket in the repetitive pattern that soothed him when the world became too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. Sarah had learned to recognize every movement, every sound, every silent signal her children sent into the universe. She had become fluent in a language most people would never understand. Her own exhaustion pressed against her like a physical weight, but sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when the gas gauge hovered near empty, not when the last of their food, a half box of crackers and 2 bruised apples, sat in a plastic bag on the passenger seat. Not when every knock on the window could be a police officer telling them they couldn't stay here, that they had to move along, as if there were anywhere left to go. 3 months ago, they'd had an apartment. It hadn't been much, just a small 2-bedroom on the edge of town with thin walls and a persistent leak in the bathroom. But it had been theirs, and Sarah had worked 2 jobs to keep it, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night while her mother watched the twins. But when her mother's health failed suddenly, when the medical bills piled higher than any paycheck could reach, when the cost of specialists for the twins drained every dollar she'd saved, the apartment slipped away like water through her fingers. The eviction notice had been taped to their door on a Tuesday morning. She remembered staring at it, the words blurring as tears she refused to shed burned behind her eyes. She'd had 72 hours to pack their lives into whatever could fit in the minivan. Everything else, the second-hand furniture, the kitchen table where they'd eaten countless meals, the shelf of books she'd read to the twins every night, all had been left behind, like ghosts of the life they'd lost. Since then, they'd moved from parking lot to parking lot, shelter to shelter, always temporary, always uncertain. The shelters were the hardest. The noise, the crowds, the unpredictable chaos sent Ethan into meltdowns that could last hours, his small body rigid with distress, his voice rising in a keening wail that shattered Sarah's heart every time. Emma would shut down completely, retreating so far inside herself that Sarah feared she might never come back. After 3 nights in the county shelter, Sarah had made the decision. They would sleep in the van. It wasn't safe, it wasn't legal, but it was quieter. And quiet was what her children needed more than anything. The judgment came from everywhere. She saw it in the eyes of the other parents at the park when she let the twins play on the swings while she rationed the last of their snacks. She heard it in the voices of social workers who suggested, with thinly veiled accusation, that perhaps she wasn't capable of caring for special needs children. She felt it in the way people looked at the van, at her unwashed hair, at the twins' mismatched clothes, as if poverty were a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Her sister, Karen, had been the loudest voice of criticism. When Sarah called asking for help, Karen's response had been cold and cutting. "You made your choices, Sarah. You chose to keep those kids when the doctors told you it would be hard. You chose to do this alone. Don't expect me to fix your mistakes." The line had gone dead before Sarah could explain that her children weren't mistakes. They were her entire world. Even the few friends she'd had before the twins were born had drifted away, uncomfortable with the reality of her life, with the unpredictability of autism, with the way normal outings could turn into crises without warning. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. Eventually, Sarah stopped reaching out. She had learned that she and her children existed in a category most people preferred to ignore. But she hadn't given up. Not yet. Every morning, she woke before dawn and searched for work, any work that would allow her to keep the twins close. She filled out applications at grocery stores, gas stations, anywhere with flexible hours. She called numbers on help-wanted signs posted in windows. She stood in line at temp agencies, hoping someone would see past her situation to the desperation and determination burning inside her. Most days ended in rejection. Employers took one look at her address, the homeless shelter listed on her paperwork, and found reasons to move on to other candidates. Others asked about childcare, and when she explained that her children had special needs, that traditional daycare wasn't an option, their expressions shifted into polite but firm refusal. A few were honest enough to say it outright. "We can't take that risk. What if something happens?" What they didn't understand was that something had already happened. She had lost everything except the two small souls sleeping in the back of this van, and she would fight with every breath in her body to keep them safe and to give them a chance at the life they deserved. The rain lightened to a drizzle as dawn crept across the sky, painting the clouds in muted shades of gray and pale yellow. Sarah stretched carefully, her back aching from another night spent half sitting, half lying in the driver's seat. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:15. In another hour, she'd need to wake the twins, help them dress in the cramped space, and drive to the public library, where they could use the bathroom and wash their faces in the sink. The librarians had stopped asking questions weeks ago. Some pretended not to notice. Others offered quiet smiles that felt like the only kindness Sarah received anymore. She was about to step outside to stretch her legs when her phone, charged overnight using the library's outlet, buzzed with a notification. An email. She almost deleted it, assuming it was another automated rejection from a job she'd applied for weeks ago. But the subject line made her pause. County auction, abandoned properties. $1 starting bid. Sarah frowned and opened the message. It was a mass notification from the county clerk's office, listing properties seized for unpaid taxes or abandoned by owners who'd vanished. Most were houses in terrible condition, lots overgrown with weeds, commercial buildings too damaged to repair. The county wanted them gone, willing to sell them for next to nothing just to clear the books and start collecting taxes again. She scrolled through the list without much interest. She had no money for a house, not even $1. But then one entry caught her eye. Lincoln Elementary School, 462 Oak Ridge Road. Built 1952. Abandoned since 2012. Structural damage. No utilities. Sold as is. Starting bid. $1. A school. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart beginning to beat faster. A school meant space, large rooms, bathrooms, maybe even a kitchen. It wouldn't have power or water, but those were problems she could work on. She'd lived without much worse. And for $1. She clicked on the link for more information. The listing included photos. The building was massive, 2 stories of red brick with tall windows, many of them broken or boarded up. The roof sagged in places. Graffiti covered the walls near the entrance. The playground behind the school had been overtaken by weeds, the swings hanging crooked, the slide rusted through. It looked like something out of a horror movie, forgotten and decaying. But Sarah didn't see the decay. She saw possibility. Once she saw rooms where the twins could run and play without disturbing neighbors. She saw walls they could paint, spaces they could fill with their laughter. She saw a place that, with enough work, could become a home. She knew it was insane. She had no money for repairs, no knowledge of construction, no way to restore utilities. But she also had nothing to lose. The auction was today at 10 o'clock at the county courthouse. She checked the time again. She had less than 4 hours. The twins stirred as sunlight filtered weakly through the fogged windows. Ethan woke first, his eyes blinking rapidly as he adjusted to wakefulness, his hands immediately resuming their tapping rhythm. Emma followed moments later, sitting up slowly and reaching for the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere, its fur matted from years of love. "Morning, Aunt Babies," Sarah said softly, turning to smile at them. "We're going on an adventure today." Emma's eyes brightened slightly, though she didn't speak. She rarely spoke, her words reserved for moments when the world felt safe enough to risk them. Ethan rocked forward and back, humming a tune only he could hear. Sarah helped them dress, navigating the cramped space with practiced efficiency. They drove to the library, where she let them use the restrooms and wash up while she filled their water bottles from the fountain. The twins knew the routine by now. They moved quietly, their small bodies adapting to a life that demanded flexibility, even when their minds craved structure and predictability. By 9:30, they were pulling into the county courthouse parking lot. The building loomed ahead, its limestone facade imposing and cold. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned off the engine. She had $1 in her wallet, one single dollar that she'd been saving for an emergency. This felt like the definition of emergency. "We're going to go inside for a little while," she told the twins, crouching to meet them at eye level. "It might be loud. There might be lots of people. But I need you both to be brave, okay? Can you do that for me?" Ethan didn't respond, but Emma nodded slowly, clutching her rabbit tighter. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. People milled around the lobby, their voices echoing off the marble floors. Sarah followed the signs to the auction room, a large chamber lined with rows of chairs facing a podium where a clerk shuffled through papers. The room was half full, mostly men in work boots and faded jeans, some flipping through auction catalogs and circling properties of interest. Sarah found 3 seats near the back and settled the twins beside her. Ethan rocked in his chair, his humming growing slightly louder. A few heads turned, eyes narrowing in judgment or curiosity. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering comfort without words. He leaned into her touch, and the humming softened. The auction began promptly at 10. The clerk, a balding man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, called out properties one by one. Most went for a few $100s, small parcels of land or dilapidated houses bought by contractors looking to flip them. The crowd thinned as properties were sold, winners stepping forward to sign paperwork before leaving. Finally, the clerk reached the listing Sarah had been waiting for. "Next item, Lincoln Elementary School, 462 Oak Ridge Road. Abandoned since 2012. Severe structural damage. Sold strictly as is with no warranties or guarantees. County assumes no responsibility for condition or safety. Starting bid is $1. Do I have $1? Silence filled the room. A few people chuckled. Someone muttered that the county should pay someone to tear it down. Sarah's hand shot up before she could second-guess herself. The clerk peered over his glasses at her. We have $1. Anyone else? More silence. A man in the front row turned to look at her, his expression somewhere between pity and confusion. Lady, you know that place is a death trap, right? Roofs half caved in, probably full of black mold. Sarah kept her hand raised, her jaw set. $1. The clerk sighed. Going once, going twice. He paused, glancing around the room one last time. Sold for $1 to bidder 27. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she approached the front desk, the twins following close behind. She signed the paperwork in a daze, her hand shaking as she handed over her single-dollar bill. The clerk processed the sale with mechanical efficiency, barely looking at her as he stamped documents and filed forms. "You'll receive the deed in the mail within 2 weeks," he said flatly. "Property is yours as of today. Good luck." She clutched the receipt, the proof that she now owned something, anything, and walked out of the courthouse in a fog. The twins stayed close, sensing her tension even if they didn't understand it. When they reached the van, Cesara sat behind the wheel and stared at the receipt in her hand. She had just bought a school, an abandoned, damaged, probably dangerous school, for $1. The rational part of her brain screamed that she'd made a terrible mistake, but the desperate part, the part that had kept her fighting through every setback and rejection, whispered something different. This was a chance. Maybe the only chance they'd get. She started the engine and pulled out her phone, typing the address into the GPS. Oak Ridge Road was on the outskirts of town, about 20 minutes away. Sarah took a deep breath and headed toward their new property, toward the building that might either save them or break her completely. The road to Oak Ridge wound through farmland that had long since been abandoned, fields overtaken by wild grass and tangled brush. The rusted farm equipment sat like forgotten monuments along the roadside. Fences sagged under the weight of vines and neglect. It felt like driving into a place the world had decided to forget. When Sarah finally turned onto Oak Ridge Road, her breath caught in her throat. The school sat at the end of a long, cracked driveway, surrounded by overgrown trees that cast dark shadows across the crumbling brick facade. It looked even worse in person than it had in the photos. The windows were mostly broken, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames like teeth. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges, one of them barely attached. Graffiti covered the lower walls, crude words and symbols spray-painted in garish colors. The playground behind the building was a wasteland of rust and decay. The swings hung at odd angles, their chains twisted and broken. The slide had collapsed in on itself, its metal surface corroded through. Weeds pushed up through the cracks in the pavement, reclaiming the land, one root at a time. Sarah parked the van in front of the building and sat for a long moment, staring at what she'd just purchased. The weight of the decision settled over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just a building. It was a monument to every bad choice, every desperate gamble, every foolish hope she'd ever clung to. But it was also hers. She turned to the twins. "Ready to see our new place?" Ethan hummed nervously. Emma clutched her rabbit but nodded. They stepped out of the van into the cool morning air. The smell hit Sarah immediately. Dampness, rot, something faintly chemical that made her stomach turn. She approached the front entrance carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on the cracked concrete. The door groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by shafts of weak sunlight filtering through the broken windows. Sarah pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a long hallway lined with lockers, most of them hanging open, their doors bent and twisted. The floor was littered with debris, broken ceiling tiles, chunks of plaster, shattered glass. "Stay close to me," Sarah said, her voice echoing strangely in the empty space. They moved slowly down the hallway, Sarah sweeping the flashlight back and forth. The walls were covered in graffiti, layer upon layer of paint and markers. Classrooms branched off on either side, their doors either missing or hanging at broken angles. Inside the rooms, desks lay overturned, textbooks scattered and water-damaged, chalkboards cracked and faded. The building smelled worse the deeper they went. Mold grew in thick patches along the walls. Water stains spread across the ceiling in ugly brown blooms. In one classroom, Sarah's flashlight caught movement, and she froze before realizing it was just pigeons roosting in the corner. They cooed softly, unbothered by the intrusion. "This is bad," Sarah whispered to herself, though she kept her voice steady for the twins. "This is really bad." They reached what must have been the main office. The counter was still intact, though covered in dust and debris. Behind it, file cabinets stood open and empty, their contents long since removed or destroyed. A clock hung crooked on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:47. Sarah turned toward a door marked Principal and pushed it open. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, with a single desk pushed against the wall and a bookshelf lying on its side. But the windows here were intact, and sunlight poured through the dirty glass, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She stepped inside, and her foot caught on something. She looked down and froze. A small pile of papers lay scattered on the floor, but these weren't student assignments or administrative forms. They were blueprints, architectural drawings. Sarah knelt and picked one up carefully, her heart beginning to race as she studied the lines and measurements. The blueprint showed the school's layout, but there was something odd about it. A section in the basement level was marked in red ink with the notation, "Restricted access, staff only." Beneath it, someone had written in faded pencil, "Sub-level storage, original 1952 construction." Sarah frowned. She hadn't seen any indication of a basement level. The auction listing hadn't mentioned one. She flipped through the other papers, finding more blueprints, all of them marked with similar notations. One showed a stairwell leading down from the cafeteria. Another indicated a heavy door at the bottom, reinforced with steel. "Sub-level storage," she murmured. "What were they storing?" Emma tugged on her sleeve, and Sarah looked down to find her daughter pointing at something across the room. Sarah followed her gaze and saw it, a small door, almost hidden behind the fallen bookshelf. It was narrow, barely 3 feet wide, and painted the same dingy beige as the walls. If Emma hadn't pointed it out, Sarah might have missed it entirely. She stood and carefully moved the bookshelf aside, the wood creaking and splintering under her hands. Behind it, the door stood intact, its surface marked with faded letters. "Maintenance access. Authorized personnel only." Sarah's pulse quickened. She tried the handle, locked. But the lock was old, corroded. She pushed harder, throwing her weight against the door. It held firm for a moment, then gave way with a sharp crack, swinging inward to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell that was different from the rest of the building. Not rot or mold, but something metallic, like old coins or iron. Sarah aimed her phone's flashlight down the stairs. The beam barely penetrated the blackness below. "Stay here," she told the twins, her voice firmer than she felt. "Right here by the door. Don't move." Ethan rocked nervously, but Emma nodded, wrapping her arm around her brother's shoulders. Sarah descended the stairs carefully, testing each step before trusting it with her weight. The walls on either side were bare concrete, cold and damp to the touch. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic smell intensified. At the bottom, she found herself in a narrow corridor, maybe 10 feet long, ending at another door. This one was different, heavier, made of reinforced steel, with a wheel lock mechanism like something from a bank vault. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just storage. This was something the school had wanted to protect, or hide. When she approached the vault door slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the wheel. It was stiff, resistant, but when she put her full weight behind it, the mechanism groaned and began to turn. The sound echoed through the corridor, a metallic shriek that made her wince. The door swung open slowly, revealing a room beyond that took Sarah's breath away. The vault was maybe 20 feet square, its walls lined with metal shelves. But what sat on those shelves made her knees weak. Boxes, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all identical, all marked with faded labels she couldn't quite read in the dim light of her phone. Sarah stepped inside, her hands shaking as she reached for the nearest box. It was surprisingly heavy, maybe the size of a shoebox, but heavier than anything that should fit inside it. She set it on the floor and carefully opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, were stacks of bills. Old bills, $100 bills with faces she barely recognized. She picked one up, her fingers trembling. The paper felt different, thicker, older than modern currency. She turned it over and saw the date, 1928. Her mind went blank. She opened another box. More bills. She opened a third. The same. She turned in a slow circle, her flashlight sweeping across the shelves. Every box, every single box was filled with money. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her back against the cold vault wall. Her phone slipped from her fingers, its light casting wild shadows across the ceiling as it clattered to the concrete. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. And schools didn't hide millions of dollars in basement vaults. This had to be fake, movie prop money, or some kind of educational tool from decades ago. But as she picked up another stack and studied the bills more carefully, she realized they weren't fake. The paper had the right texture. The printing was precise, detailed in ways that counterfeits never managed. And the dates, they ranged from the 1920s through the early 1950s. This money had been hidden here for decades. How much was here? Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to calculate. If each box held even a fraction of what the first few contained. Her thoughts spiraled. Tens of millions, maybe more. Maybe. She couldn't finish the thought. It was too impossible, too insane. Above her, she heard the twins calling out, their voices tinged with worry. Sarah scrambled to her feet, grabbing her phone and stumbling toward the door. She needed to get upstairs. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what to do. But as she reached the stairs, one truth settled in her chest with absolute certainty. Her children weren't homeless anymore. Not if this money was real. Not if even a fraction of it could be kept. They were going to be okay. Finally, impossibly, they were going to be okay. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs, emerged into the office, and found the twins exactly where she'd left them. They looked at her with wide eyes, sensing something had changed even if they didn't understand what. Sarah knelt down and pulled them both into a fierce hug, tears streaming down her face for the first time in months. "We're going to be okay," she whispered into their hair, her voice breaking. "I promise you, we're going to be okay." But even as she held them, her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Where had this money come from? Why was it here? And most importantly, what happened when the world found out? Sarah didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The twins dozed fitfully in the back of the minivan, parked once again behind the shuttered grocery store. But Sarah sat rigid in the driver's seat, staring at nothing, her mind spinning in endless circles. The memory of that vault, of those hundreds of boxes filled with old currency, played over and over like a film reel she couldn't stop. It had to be fake. That was the only logical explanation. Someone had used the school for something illegal, maybe a movie production or an elaborate prank. Old bills weren't worth their face value anyway, were they? She knew collectible currency could be valuable, but this much? It seemed impossible. But what if it wasn't fake? What if she'd stumbled onto something real? The weight of that possibility pressed against her chest like a stone. If the money was real, then everything changed. Her children would have a future. They'd have therapy, education, stability. They'd have everything she'd been fighting so desperately to give them. And yet, the discovery felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. Money hidden in a vault beneath an abandoned school didn't get there by accident. Someone had put it there. Someone had built that vault, filled it, locked it, and then… What? Forgotten about it? Died before retrieving it? Been forced to leave it behind? Every scenario her tired mind constructed ended with danger, with questions she didn't know how to answer, with attention she couldn't afford to attract. By dawn, Sarah had made a decision. She needed to know the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to understand what she was dealing with. She needed someone to verify whether the currency was real without revealing where it came from or how much there was. That meant finding an expert who would keep quiet, who wouldn't ask too many questions. The twins woke slowly, their small bodies stiff from another night cramped in the van. Sarah helped them dress and drove to the library as usual, but her movements felt mechanical, her thoughts elsewhere. While Emma and Ethan settled in the children's section with picture books, Sarah used one of the public computers to search for currency experts in the area. Most of the results were large auction houses or dealers who advertised their services prominently. Too public, too risky. But buried in the search results, she found a small listing for a shop called Hartwell Coins and Collectibles, located in a strip mall on the east side of town. The website was simple, almost amateurish, with a phone number and an address, but little else. The owner's name was listed as Marcus Hartwell. Sarah copied the address into her phone. She had taken one bill from the vault, a single $100 note dated 1934, folded carefully and hidden in her pocket. It felt like carrying a live bomb, but she couldn't verify the entire discovery without starting with a single piece. The strip mall was exactly what she'd expected. Faded, half empty, and anchored by a struggling laundromat and a nail salon with flickering neon signs. Hartwell Coins and Collectibles occupied a corner unit with dusty windows and a hand-painted sign that had seen better days. Sarah parked the van and studied the building for a long moment, gathering her courage. "We're going to visit a shop," she told the twins. "It might be a little boring, but I need you both to be patient. Can you do that?" Emma nodded silently. Ethan rocked in his seat, but didn't protest. The shop's door chimed as they entered, a small brass bell announcing their arrival. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered. Glass display cases lined with coins, stamps, and old currency under fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. The air smelled of old paper and metal polish. Behind the counter sat a man in his 60s, thin and weathered, but with wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. He looked up from a magnifying glass and a tray of coins, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to curiosity when he saw Sarah and the twins. "Help you?" His voice was gravelly, the tone of someone who'd spent too many years smoking and not enough years sleeping. Sarah approached the counter slowly, the twins flanking her like small shadows. I found something. Old currency. I was hoping you could tell me if it's real." Marcus Hartwell set down his magnifying glass and studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The worn clothes, the exhaustion carved into her face, the way her children pressed close to her like they were afraid the world might snatch them away. His expression softened slightly. "Let's see what you've got." Sarah pulled the folded bill from her pocket and carefully placed it on the counter between them. Hartwell picked it up with practiced care, holding it up to the light, his eyes narrowing. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his pocket and examined the bill in silence that stretched so long Sarah's heart began to hammer. Finally, he set it down and looked at her. "Where did you get this?" It was in something I inherited." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue, but she forced it out. "Is it real?" Hartwell studied her for another long moment, then looked back at the bill. "It's real. 1934 series. Federal Reserve note. Good condition, considering its age." He paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. You know what something like this is worth? Sarah shook her head, afraid to speak. Why, in this condition? Conservatively, maybe $300. Could be more to the right collector. He set the bill down carefully. You said you inherited it. Was there more? The question hung in the air like a trap. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to lie, to take the bill and leave, to never come back. But she needed more information, needed to understand the scope of what she'd found. Maybe, she said carefully. I'm not sure yet. I'm still sorting through things. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I'll give you $500 for this one. Cash, no paperwork. The offer stunned her. $500. That was food for weeks, gas for the van, maybe even a cheap motel room where the twins could sleep in real beds for a few nights. But giving up even one bill felt like giving up a piece of their future. I need to think about it, Sarah said, reaching for the bill. Her hand trembled. Hartwell pushed it back toward her. No pressure, but if you find more, and you need someone who can evaluate them without asking too many questions, you come back here, understand? She nodded, folding the bill carefully and tucking it back into her pocket. Thank you. As she turned to leave, Hartwell spoke again. Ma'am, whatever you found, be careful. Old money like that, it doesn't just appear. Someone put it somewhere, and someone might come looking for it. The warning followed her out of the shop and into the bright afternoon sunlight. Sarah's hands shook as she buckled the twins into the van. $500 for one bill. If the currency expert was right, if each bill was worth several times its face value, then the boxes in that vault. She couldn't finish the calculation. The numbers were too big, too impossible. But even a conservative estimate put the total value in the tens of millions. Maybe more. Maybe much more. The drive back to Oak Ridge Road happened in a daze. Sarah knew she needed to go back to the school, needed to understand the full extent of what was hidden there. But fear warred with hope inside her chest, making it hard to breathe. She parked the van in front of the building and sat for a moment, staring at the crumbling brick facade. Are we going inside? Emma asked quietly, her voice so soft, Sarah almost missed it. She turned to look at her daughter, this brave, silent child who'd endured so much without complaint. Yes, baby. We're going inside. This time, Sarah came prepared. She'd stopped at a dollar store and bought a flashlight with batteries, a notebook, and a pen. If she was going to understand this discovery, she needed to approach it methodically. She needed to count, to document, to think clearly instead of letting emotion overwhelm her. The school felt different in the afternoon light. Less menacing, maybe, but no less decayed. Sarah led the twins through the familiar halls, past the principal's office, and down the narrow maintenance stairs to the vault. The steel door stood open where she'd left it, and the cold metallic air rushed up to meet them. Stay at the top of the stairs, Sarah instructed. I'll be right down there. You can see me the whole time. The twins settled on the top step, Emma wrapping an arm around Ethan as he rocked gently. Sarah descended into the vault, her new flashlight cutting a stronger beam through the darkness. The boxes sat exactly as she'd left them, silent witnesses to a secret decades old. She began systematically, starting with the shelf closest to the door. Each box was labeled with a number and a year. The first box read 1928-001. Sarah opened it carefully and began counting. 100 bills, each one a $100 note, $10,000 face value. But if each bill was worth $300 or more, her hand shook as she wrote the number in her notebook. She moved to the next box. Same contents. The third box, the same. She counted 12 boxes on the first shelf, each one identical. 12 boxes, 100 bills each, 1,200 bills on one shelf alone. Sarah looked around the vault, her flashlight sweeping across the other shelves. There were at least 20 shelves, maybe more, and each shelf seemed to hold roughly the same number of boxes. The calculation hit her like a physical blow. If there were 20 shelves, and each shelf held 12 boxes, that was 240 boxes total. If each box held 100 bills, 24,000 bills. At $100 face value each, that was $2.4 million in face value alone. But if the collectible value multiplied that by 3 or 4 or more, Sarah's legs gave out again, and she sank to the concrete floor, the notebook falling from her hands. This wasn't just money. This was generational wealth. This was enough to change not just her life, but the lives of her children and their children. This was freedom. But the voice in the back of her mind wouldn't stay quiet. Where did it come from? Why was it here? And what would happen when someone found out? She forced herself to keep counting, to keep documenting. 2 hours passed as she methodically opened box after box, noting their contents, their dates, their condition. The currency ranged from 1920s silver certificates to 1950s Federal Reserve notes. Some boxes held nothing but $50 bills. Others contained an assortment of denominations. One box held nothing but $2 bills from 1953, each one crisp and perfect as if printed yesterday. By the time she finished the initial survey, the truth was unavoidable. The vault contained somewhere between 200 and 300 boxes. The total face value was staggering, but the collectible value, Sarah couldn't even wrap her mind around it. 50 million, 100 million, maybe more. The exact number almost didn't matter. It was more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs numb, her mind reeling. The twins waited patiently, though Ethan's humming had grown more insistent. She gathered them both in her arms and held them tight, breathing in the scent of their hair, grounding herself in their solid, real presence. "Mom," Emma whispered, "are you okay?" Sarah pulled back and looked into her daughter's worried eyes. "Yeah, baby, I'm okay. Better than okay." But even as she said it, she knew the hard part was just beginning. The discovery was one thing. Figuring out what to do with it was something else entirely. Over the next week, Sarah fell into a strange new routine. During the day, she and the twins lived in the van, moving between the library, the park, and the handful of places where they could exist without drawing too much attention. But every evening, as the sun began to set, they returned to the school. Sarah had begun clearing out one of the first-floor classrooms, the one closest to the main entrance with the most intact windows. She swept away debris, pulled the broken desks into a pile in the corner, and used a tarp from a hardware store to cover the worst of the water damage. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It was hers. The twins seemed to sense that something had changed. They explored the building with growing confidence, their voices echoing through the empty halls in ways that would have been impossible in the cramped van or crowded shelters. Ethan found a classroom with an old piano, its keys yellowed and several notes dead. But he sat at the bench and pressed the working keys in repetitive patterns that soothed him. Emma discovered the library, its shelves mostly empty, but a few moldy books still scattered across the floor. She sat among them, turning pages with gentle care, even though the words had long since become unreadable. Sarah watched them play and felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time in months, they had space. They had freedom. They had possibility. But the outside world hadn't forgotten about her. Word of the auction had spread through town, and people who'd laughed at her for buying a condemned school now laughed even harder when they drove past and saw her van parked in front of it. Her sister Karen called one evening, her voice dripping with false concern. "I heard you bought that old school on Oak Ridge." "Sarah, please tell me that's not true." "It's true," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "For God's sake, why? That place is a disaster. You don't have money for repairs. You don't have money for anything. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking my children needed a roof over their heads." "That's not a roof. That's a death trap. You're going to get yourself killed, or worse, get those kids hurt. You need to let them go, Sarah. Let someone who can actually care for them." Sarah hung up. Her hand shook with rage as she silenced the phone. Let them go. As if her children were burdens to be discarded. As if love wasn't enough to overcome poverty. But Karen's words echoed in her mind anyway, mixing with the doubts already festering there. The school was dangerous. The roof leaked. The walls were unstable. She had no money for repairs, on no skills to fix what was broken. Even with the currency hidden in the vault, she couldn't access it without drawing attention she couldn't afford. The next day, while the twins played in their usual spots, Sarah ventured into other parts of the school she hadn't explored yet. The cafeteria was a disaster. Tables overturned, kitchen equipment stripped out, floor tiles cracked and missing. But in the back, she found the old food storage area, its shelves still intact, and beside it, a door marked Boiler Room. She pushed it open cautiously. The room beyond was vast, filled with old industrial heating equipment that hadn't run in over a decade. Pipes snaked across the ceiling like metal vines. But against the far wall, Sarah noticed something odd. A second door, smaller than the first. I painted the same institutional beige as everything else. She wouldn't have noticed it if not for the faint draft coming from beneath it. She crossed the room carefully, avoiding puddles and loose debris, and tried the handle. Locked. But the lock was old, rusty. She remembered the maintenance stairs, how easy they'd been to force open. She put her shoulder against the door and pushed. It gave way with a groan, swinging inward to reveal another set of stairs, these ones descending even deeper than the first vault. Sarah's pulse quickened. Her flashlight beam trembled as she aimed it downward. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. No response, just the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. She descended carefully. These stairs were older, rougher, for carved from stone rather than poured concrete. The walls were damp, slick with moisture. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic smell she'd noticed before intensified until it was almost overwhelming. At the bottom, she found herself in a corridor identical to the first, but this one ended not in a vault door, but in a heavy wooden door with iron hinges. Carved into the wood, barely visible under layers of grime, were words. Archives. Lincoln County School District, 1952. Sarah's breath caught. Archives. Not just storage. Archives meant records, documents, maybe answers to where the money had come from. She tried the door. To her surprise, it opened easily, the hinges groaning but functional. The room beyond took her breath away. It was massive, maybe 50 feet across, with high ceilings supported by stone arches. Filing cabinets lined every wall, dozens of them, all labeled with years and names. In the center of the room sat a large wooden table, its surface covered in dust, but otherwise intact. And on that table lay an open ledger, its pages yellowed but legible. Sarah approached slowly, her flashlight illuminating the handwritten entries. The ledger appeared to be some kind of financial record, with columns for dates, amounts, and cryptic notations. She turned the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the entries. Most of it meant nothing to her. References to deposits, transfers, allocations. But then, buried among the mundane entries, she found something that made her blood run cold. Emergency Reserve Fund, Federal Authorization, March 1933. $247 million. $247 million. Now, Sarah read the entry 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding, but the number remained the same. And beneath it, a notation. Per Executive Order 6102, Emergency Banking Relief Act. Funds secured in District Vault, pending further instruction. Her hands shook as she continued reading. The entries that followed detailed deposits made throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Millions of dollars in currency moved from banks to secure locations during the Great Depression and World War II. And this school, this forgotten building on Oak Ridge Road, had been one of those locations. The government had hidden the money here. During the chaos of economic collapse and war, someone had decided that an unassuming elementary school in a quiet town was the perfect place to stash emergency reserves. And then, somehow, the money had been forgotten. Lost in bureaucratic shuffle, misplaced in the confusion of changing administrations, buried under decades of paperwork and neglect. Sarah sank into a chair at the table, her mind spinning. This wasn't stolen money. This was government money, hidden during a national crisis and never retrieved. Which meant, what did it mean? That it belonged to the government? That she was obligated to return it? Or had it been abandoned, forgotten long enough that it legally belonged to whoever found it? She had no idea, but one thing was certain. If the government found out, they'd take it back. All of it. Her children's future would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah spent the next hour searching through the filing cabinets, pulling out documents and scanning their contents. Most were mundane school records, but buried among them, she found more evidence of the vault. Letters from federal agents to school administrators. Instructions for maintaining security. Warnings about keeping the project classified. One letter, dated 1955, caught her attention. It was from someone at the Treasury Department to the Lincoln County School Board, requesting information about emergency fund relocations completed during the previous administration. The reply, written in precise typewriter font, stated simply, "All materials previously stored at Lincoln Elementary have been relocated per federal instruction. Facility has been cleared." But that was a lie. The vault was still full. The money had never been moved, which meant someone at the school level, maybe the principal or a board member, had lied to the federal government. They'd claimed the money was gone when it was actually still sitting in the basement. Had they planned to steal it themselves? Had they died before they could? Had fear or guilt paralyzed them into inaction? Sarah would never know. But the evidence was clear. The money had been forgotten by everyone except the few local officials who'd hidden the truth, and those officials were long dead. She gathered several key documents, folding them carefully and tucking them into her jacket. She needed time to think, to process, to figure out her next move. But as she climbed the stairs back to the main level, one truth crystallized in her mind. The money was legally gray at best. Claiming it would bring scrutiny she couldn't afford. But leaving it untouched meant condemning her children to continue living in poverty when salvation sat just beneath their feet. When she emerged from the boiler room, she found Emma and Ethan waiting near the entrance, their faces anxious. She'd been gone longer than she'd intended, and they'd clearly worried. "I'm sorry, babies," she said, pulling them into a hug. "I got distracted. You ready to go?" As they walked back to the van, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She couldn't take all the money at once. That would be impossible to explain, impossible to hide. But what if she took it slowly, a few bills at a time, enough to start rebuilding their lives without drawing attention? She could sell the currency through people like Hartwell, small transactions that wouldn't raise red flags. She could use the money to fix the school gradually, making it livable, She could hire contractors, pay in cash, create a paper trail that showed she was using savings she'd supposedly inherited. It would take time. It would take careful planning. But it was possible. Maybe. That night, parked behind the grocery store again, Sarah made her decision. She would take one box, just one. Enough to start making changes, to give her children stability while she figured out the larger problem. Tomorrow, she would begin. But as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she didn't notice the car that had followed her from Oak Ridge Road. Didn't see the figure sitting in the darkness, watching the van with patient, calculating eyes. Someone else had noticed her frequent trips to the abandoned school, and they wanted to know why. The next morning arrived with false brightness, sunlight streaming through the van's fogged windows, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis the night before. Sarah woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle, her mind immediately flooding with thoughts of the vault, the documents, the impossible sum of money waiting beneath the school. But as she sat up and glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood went cold. The car was still there. A dark sedan, parked 3 spaces behind her, its windows tinted so she couldn't see inside. It had been there last night. She was certain of it. The same car, the same position. Not moving, just watching. Sarah's pulse hammered in her throat. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone else was sleeping in their car, just like her. Maybe it was coincidence. But instinct told her otherwise. She started the van as casually as she could manage and pulled out of the parking lot, watching the rearview mirror. The sedan's engine came to life. It followed, keeping a careful distance, but never quite disappearing from view. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Someone knew. Someone had been watching her trips to the school, had noticed her strange behavior, had put pieces together. But who? And what did they want? She drove aimlessly for 20 minutes, making random turns, testing whether the car would follow. It did. Every turn, every stop, the sedan maintained its distance like a shadow she couldn't shake. The twins sat quietly in the back, sensing her tension but not understanding it. Emma clutched her rabbit. Ethan rocked gently, humming under his breath. Finally, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't lead this person to the school, couldn't reveal what she'd found. But she also couldn't keep driving forever. She needed to know who was following her and why. She pulled into a busy parking lot at a strip mall, the same one where Hartwell's shop was located. The sedan followed, but parked several spaces away. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned off the engine and sat perfectly still, waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the sedan's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, maybe 50, with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested years of outdoor work. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, nothing threatening, but his eyes were sharp as he approached the van. Sarah's hand moved to the door lock, ready to drive away. But then the man stopped a respectful distance from her window and raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called out, "my name is David Brennan. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." Sarah cracked the window an inch, her body tense. "How do you know my name?" "I've been asking around," Brennan said carefully. "You bought the old Lincoln School at auction. People talk in small towns. I heard about it, and I got curious." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I also used to work for the County Historical Society. That school's been on my radar for years." "Why?" Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. Brennan glanced around the parking lot, then back at her. "Can we talk somewhere private? There are things you need to know about that building, and things that aren't in any public records." Every instinct Sarah had screamed at her to drive away, to protect her discovery at all costs. But something in Brennan's expression made her hesitate. He didn't look threatening. He looked worried. "The twins stay with me," she said finally. "We don't go anywhere alone." Brennan nodded quickly. "Of course. There's a diner across the street. We can talk there. My treat." Sarah studied him for another long moment, weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded. 5 minutes. That's all you get. The diner was one of those timeless places that seemed to exist outside of normal reality. Worn vinyl booths and laminate tables that had absorbed decades of conversations. Sarah settled the twins in a booth near the window where she could see the parking lot, ordering them pancakes and juice before turning her attention to Brennan. He sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his expression serious. "First thing you need to know is that I'm not after your money. Whatever you found in that school, it's yours, as far as I'm concerned." Sarah's face remained carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not stupid, and neither are you." Brennan leaned forward slightly. "I've been researching that school for 15 years. I know about the vaults. I know about the federal money that was supposedly relocated in the 1950s. And I know it never actually left." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "If you knew, why didn't you buy the school yourself?" "Because I couldn't prove it," Brennan said simply. "The Historical Society wouldn't fund an acquisition based on rumors and half-destroyed records. I tried for years to get access to the building, but the county kept it locked up tight. When I heard it was going to auction, I planned to bid. But then I saw you walk out with the deed, and I thought..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I thought maybe someone else needed it more than I did. So why follow me?" "Because you're in danger." Brennan's voice dropped lower. "You're not the only one who knows about that money. There are people, collectors, treasure hunters, people who've been tracking federal gold reserves and emergency funds for decades. They know the official records don't match the actual relocations. They've been waiting for that school to come up for sale." Sarah felt ice spread through her veins. "Or you're saying people will come after me?" "I'm saying they already are." Brennan pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket and slid it across the table. It was a local paper from 2 days ago. Circled in red ink was a small article about the school auction, mentioning Sarah by name and including a quote from the county clerk about the property being sold as is for $1. "This article went out to several regional papers," Brennan said quietly. "By now, anyone who's been watching for Lincoln Elementary to go on the market knows you own it. They'll be coming to investigate. Some of them won't be polite about it." Sarah's hands shook as she set down the newspaper. The twins ate their pancakes, oblivious to the conversation happening above their heads. "What am I supposed to do?" "First, you need to secure that building," Brennan said firmly. "Get locks, real ones, industrial grade. Board up the entrances you're not using. Make it look like you're just fixing the place up for renovation, not guarding something valuable." He paused. "Second, you need to document everything you've found. Take photos. Keep records. If someone tries to claim the money belongs to them, you need proof that you found it legally on your property." "And third?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Third, you need to be ready to defend your claim, legally and otherwise." Brennan's expression softened. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you, but treasure hunting brings out the worst in people. They'll lie, they'll threaten, they'll do whatever it takes to get what they think is theirs. Now you need to be prepared." Sarah looked at her children, at Emma carefully cutting her pancakes into precise squares, at Ethan counting his bites in a whispered rhythm. She'd been so focused on the miracle of the discovery that she hadn't considered the danger it might bring. But Brennan was right. Money like this didn't just sit quietly. It attracted predators. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. Brennan was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "My daughter has autism," he said softly. "She's 23 now. But when she was young, we went through hell trying to find resources, trying to keep her safe. I know what it's like to fight a system that doesn't care, to watch people judge you for circumstances beyond your control." He met Sarah's eyes. "You bought that school with your last dollar. That takes courage. Or desperation. Probably both. Whatever you found in there, you earned it." Tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Brennan reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "This is my number. You call me if anything happens, if anyone shows up asking questions. I know people. Lawyers, contractors, security guys. I can help you protect what's yours." Sarah took the card, her fingers closing around it like a lifeline. For the first time since making the discovery, she didn't feel completely alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah threw herself into transforming the school. Using money she claimed came from family savings, she hired a locksmith to install heavy-duty locks on every entrance. She bought thick chains and padlocks for the gates around the property. She hired a handyman to board up the broken windows and patch the worst of the roof damage. To anyone watching, it looked like she was simply securing a property she planned to renovate. But every night after the workers left, Sarah descended into the vault and systematically photographed every box, every stack of bills, every document she could find. She cataloged everything in a notebook she kept hidden beneath the van's spare tire. She made copies of the federal documents and stored them in 3 separate locations. A safe deposit box she rented at a bank across town with Brennan's lawyer, and in a cloud storage account she created using the library's computer. She also began carefully selling currency through Hartwell. Never more than a few bills at a time, on always from different boxes, never enough to establish a pattern. Hartwell asked no questions, counting out cash with the efficiency of someone who'd been on both sides of the law and learned not to care which side he stood on. The money accumulated slowly. 500 here, 800 there, occasionally 1,000 for a particularly rare note. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had $15,000 in cash hidden in the van. It felt like a fortune and a pittance all at once, enough to change their immediate circumstances, but nowhere near enough to transform their lives completely. The twins began to thrive in ways Sarah hadn't seen in months. The school, despite its decay, gave them space to be themselves. Ethan found a classroom with good acoustics and spent hours there, humming and singing, and his voice echoing beautifully off the walls. Emma discovered the old art room and spent time arranging found objects into careful patterns, her silent language speaking through the organization of abandoned things. Sarah started sleeping in the school instead of the van, clearing out 3 adjoining classrooms on the first floor. One became a makeshift bedroom for the twins, with sleeping bags on clean tarps and a camping lantern for light. Another became her own space. The third became a common area where they ate meals and spent time together. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And it was warmer, safer, more stable than the van had ever been. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as Sarah was locking the main entrance for the night, she heard voices outside. Male voices, confident and demanding. She peered through a gap in the boarded windows and felt her stomach drop. 3 men stood by the gates, examining the new locks with professional interest. They weren't dressed like treasure hunters from movies. They looked like businessmen, suits and ties, expensive shoes. But there was something predatory in the way they moved, in the way they studied the building like they were already planning how to get inside. One of them pulled out a phone and made a call. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she saw him gesture toward the school, saw him nod as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, he said something to his companions and all three of them laughed. Sarah's blood ran cold. These weren't casual observers. These were people who knew exactly what they were looking for. She gathered the twins quickly and led them to a small storage closet in the back of her makeshift apartment. "Stay here," she whispered. "Stay quiet. Don't come out until I come get you." Emma's eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded. Ethan rocked anxiously but didn't protest. Sarah closed the door gently and returned to the window. The men were testing the gates now, pulling on the chains, examining the locks. One of them produced a set of bolt cutters from a backpack. They were coming in. Sarah's hand shook as she pulled out her phone and called Brennan. He answered on the first ring. "They're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "3 men. They're trying to get through the gates." "Lock yourself in," Brennan said immediately. "I'm calling the sheriff. Don't confront them. Or just stay hidden. I have my children here. All the more reason to stay out of sight. I'm 10 minutes away. The sheriff's closer. Just hold on." Sarah hung up and crouched by the window, watching as the men cut through the chain with surprising ease. The gate swung open, and they stepped onto the property like they owned it. One of them pulled out a flashlight and swept it across the building's facade. "Federal Emergency Reserve," one of them said, his voice carrying in the quiet evening. "If the documents are right, there should be 2 vaults. Maybe more. This is the biggest find in 30 years. "Assuming it's still here," another replied. "Could have been cleaned out decades ago." "No," the first man said confidently. "The Mitchell woman bought this place for $1 and immediately started securing it. She knows. And she found something." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. They knew her name. They'd been researching her, tracking her movements. This wasn't random. This was calculated. The men approached the main entrance, testing the door. The new lock held firm. One of them pulled out a crowbar. "We can't just break in," the third man said nervously. "That's breaking and entering." "She doesn't have a legal claim to federal property," the first man replied coldly. "If the money's here, it belongs to the government. We're just recovering lost assets. She owns the building. The court documents are clear. The building, yes, not the contents. Federal property doesn't transfer with real estate. It's abandoned property law. We have every right to investigate." Sarah's mind raced. Were they right? Did she have legal claim to the money? Or could it be taken from her? She had no idea. But she knew one thing with certainty. If these men got inside, they wouldn't leave without taking everything. The crowbar struck the door frame with a metallic clang. The wood splintered, but the lock held. The man cursed and struck again, harder this time. Then, like a miracle, sirens wailed in the distance. The men froze, looking at each other. The one with the crowbar dropped it and stepped back from the door. "We need to go," the nervous one said. "We're not done here," the leader replied, but his voice held less confidence. "We'll come back with a court order. Legal authorization to investigate federal property. She won't be able to stop us." The 3 men retreated quickly, disappearing through the gate just as 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled into the driveway, their lights painting the school in alternating red and blue. Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. The sheriff's deputy who took her statement was young, maybe 25, with a kind face and patient demeanor. He listened as Sarah explained about the men, the attempted break-in, the threats. He took photos of the damage to the doorframe and collected the abandoned crowbar as evidence. "Do you know who they were?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "They mentioned federal property, something about investigating lost assets." The deputy's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "There's been some talk around the county, rumors about this school, about money hidden during the Depression. Most people think it's just local legend." He paused, studying her carefully. "Is there any truth to it?" Sarah met his eyes, her heart pounding. I bought this building legally at auction. Whatever's inside is mine." "That's true," the deputy said slowly. "But if federal property is involved, that gets complicated. You might want to talk to a lawyer." When Brennan arrived 15 minutes later, he found Sarah sitting on the front steps, shaking despite the warm evening air. He sat beside her, not speaking, just offering presence. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "They're going to take it from me," she whispered. "They're going to claim it's federal property, and they're going to take everything." "Not if we move first," Brennan said firmly. "I've been thinking about this since you first told me what you found. There's a process for claiming abandoned property. We need to file with the Treasury Department, disclose the find, and establish your legal claim before anyone else can contest it. But won't they just take it once I report it?" "Maybe some of it," Brennan admitted, "but not all. There are laws protecting finders, especially when property has been abandoned for this long. You found it on your legally owned property. You have rights. We just need to establish them before someone else tries to claim otherwise." Sarah looked at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. "How long will it take?" "Months, maybe a year. These things move slowly in the federal system. But in the meantime, you'll have legal protection. No one can just come in and take what you found. Not without a court order. And those are hard to get when you've established a legitimate claim." That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay on the floor of her makeshift bedroom, listening to the twins breathe in the next room, thinking about everything that had happened. The discovery, the danger, the impossible decision ahead of her. She could report the find and risk losing most of it to bureaucracy. Or she could stay silent and risk losing everything to people who had no legal or moral claim to it. By morning, she'd made her choice. With Brennan's help, Sarah hired a lawyer who specialized in treasure trove law and abandoned property claims. The initial consultation cost $3,000, money she paid in cash from her growing fund. The lawyer, a sharp woman in her 40s named Patricia Chen, listened to Sarah's story with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary," Chen said, reviewing the documents Sarah had brought. "If what you're telling me is accurate, this is one of the largest undiscovered federal reserves in history. The legal battle is going to be intense." "Can I win?" Sarah asked bluntly. "Define win," Chen replied. "Can you keep all the money? Unlikely. The government will claim a significant portion. But can you keep enough to change your life? Absolutely. There are precedents for finders keeping anywhere from 30 to 60% of abandoned federal property, depending on circumstances. 30 to 60%. Sarah did the math in her head. Even at the conservative end, that was still tens of millions of dollars. More money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Over the next month, Sarah and her legal team prepared the most comprehensive property claim in Lincoln County history. They cataloged every box in the vault, every bill, every document. They hired independent auditors to verify the currency's authenticity. They secured the building with professional security systems, cameras, alarms. They filed disclosure forms with the Treasury Department, the IRS, and half a dozen other federal agencies Sarah had never heard of. The process was exhausting, expensive, and terrifying. But slowly, the pieces fell into place. News of the discovery leaked, of course. Within weeks, reporters descended on Oak Ridge Road, their cameras capturing the crumbling school and the improbable story of the homeless single mother who'd stumbled onto generational wealth. The coverage was a mix of sensationalism and genuine human interest. Some outlets painted Sarah as a hero, a symbol of perseverance rewarded. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she'd somehow known about the money before buying the school. But the most satisfying moment came when Karen called. Sarah was in the middle of directing a contractor working on the school's roof when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Sarah," Karen's voice was strained, false brightness barely masking shock. "I saw the news. Is it true? About the money?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. A long pause. Then, "I want to apologize for what I said before, about the twins, about you not being able to care for them. I was wrong. I should have been more supportive." Sarah's jaw tightened. "You told me to give up my children. I was worried about you. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "You meant every word. And you know what? That's okay. Because your judgment, your mockery, everyone who laughed at me for buying this school, you all taught me something important. You taught me that I'm stronger than anyone thought, including myself." She hung up before Karen could respond, and for the first time in years, she felt no guilt about it. The federal investigation took 6 months. Teams of auditors, historians, and Treasury officials descended on the school, documenting everything, verifying records, establishing the chain of custody for money that had been hidden for over 70 years. The media attention was intense, but Sarah learned to navigate it with help from a public relations consultant Brennan recommended. Through it all, the twins adapted in ways that amazed her. Emma slowly began speaking more, her words still careful and measured, but coming more frequently. Ethan's routine stabilized now that they had a permanent home, his anxiety decreasing as predictability increased. They both thrived with the specialists and therapists Sarah could finally afford, their unique minds flowering in an environment that celebrated rather than punished their differences. The final settlement came down 15 months after the initial discovery. The Treasury Department claimed 65% of the total value, citing abandoned federal property laws. The remaining 35%, after taxes and legal fees, came to just under $104 million. $104 million for a woman who'd once considered a $5 meal a luxury. Sarah stood in the newly renovated school, now transformed into a beautiful residential and educational space, and reading the settlement documents. Around her, the building hummed with life. The hallways she'd once walked in darkness now gleamed with fresh paint and warm lighting. The classrooms that had been filled with decay now hosted therapy sessions, art classes, music rooms, all of it designed specifically for children like her twins. She'd used part of the money to establish a foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families with special needs children. The school itself had become the headquarters, offering free services, resources, and a community that understood the unique challenges these families faced. Other parents walked the halls now, their children playing safely in spaces designed for their needs, their relief and gratitude palpable. Emma appeared at her side, now 7 years old, and growing taller every day. "Mama, can I show you what I made?" Sarah smiled, tears gathering in her eyes at the sound of her daughter's voice, so much stronger now than it had been a year ago. "Of course, baby." Emma led her to the art room, where a massive mural covered one wall. It showed a building, small and broken, slowly transforming into something beautiful. At the bottom, Emma had written in careful letters, "Home is where you're brave enough to stay." Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of paint and possibility. Ethan joined them moments later, his humming soft and content, his body relaxed in a way it had never been when they lived in the van. "We did it," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to her children or to herself. "We really did it." That evening, as the sun set over Oak Ridge Road, Sarah stood on the school's newly repaired front steps and looked out at the land she now owned. The playground had been rebuilt, its swings sturdy and bright, its slide gleaming in the fading light. The gardens she'd planted were beginning to bloom, flowers pushing up through soil that had known only weeds for decades. In the distance, she could see the county road, the same road she'd driven down in desperation 15 months ago with her last dollar and nowhere else to turn. She thought about that version of herself, about the fear and shame and desperate hope that had driven her to bid on a building everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the mockery, the judgment, the certainty in everyone's eyes that she had made a terrible mistake. She thought about Karen's cruel words, about the shelter workers who'd looked at her with pity, about the employers who'd rejected her without a second thought. And she thought about the vault, about the moment she'd opened those first boxes and seen a future she'd thought was impossible. Money changed things. That was undeniable. The financial security meant her children would have every resource they needed, every opportunity, every chance to become whoever they were meant to be. But the money wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure was the moment she'd realized she was strong enough to fight for them, brave enough to take a risk when everyone told her she was foolish, determined enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. Brennan's car pulled into the driveway, and he stepped out carrying pizza boxes and a bottle of sparkling cider. And he'd become a fixture in their lives, a friend when Sarah had desperately needed one, a voice of reason when chaos threatened to overwhelm her. "Celebration dinner," he called out, grinning. Sarah smiled back. "Always." They ate on the front steps as the stars began to emerge, the twins laughing at Brennan's terrible jokes, Sarah feeling a peace she'd thought she'd never know. The building behind them stood solid and safe, transformed from a symbol of decay into a beacon of hope. The media had called it a miracle, the discovery of the century, a modern fairy tale. But Sarah knew the truth. It wasn't the money that had saved them. It was the courage to keep going when everything seemed lost. It was the refusal to give up on her children when the world told her to let them go. It was the stubborn belief that they deserved a chance. No, even when no one else would give them one. The money had been hidden in the dark for 70 years, waiting. But Sarah had been hiding too, in poverty, in shame, in the shadows of a society that had decided she and her children didn't matter. The discovery hadn't just revealed a fortune. It had revealed her own strength, her own worth, her own right to fight for the life her family deserved. As the evening deepened and the twins began to yawn, Sarah gathered them up and carried them inside, one under each arm, their bodies warm and solid and real against her chest. She tucked them into beds in their new bedrooms, rooms with windows that locked and walls that didn't shake, and floors that didn't move beneath them. Emma fell asleep clutching her rabbit, but now there was a smile on her face. Ethan's humming faded into soft breathing. Now his body finally at rest in a way it had never been in the van. Sarah stood in the doorway between their rooms, watching them sleep, and felt gratitude so overwhelming it nearly brought her to her knees. They'd survived. Against every odd, every obstacle, every person who'd said they couldn't. They'd survived. And more than that, they'd found home. Not in the building, though the building mattered. Not in the money, though the money helped. But in the realization that they were enough, exactly as they were, worthy of safety and love and futures that stretched out bright and hopeful before them. Sarah walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the night. Somewhere out there were other families like hers, other parents fighting impossible battles, other children who needed someone to believe in them. The foundation would help some of them. The community she was building would support others. But she couldn't save everyone. She could only tell her story and hope it gave someone else the courage to keep fighting. She thought about the woman who'd walked into that county courthouse 15 months ago with $1 and a prayer. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, to believing the voices that said she wasn't enough, that her children would be better off without her. and she thought about the truth she'd learned in the darkness of that vault, that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in the places everyone else overlooks, in abandoned buildings, in broken families, in struggling mothers who refuse to quit even when quitting would be easier. The money had been waiting 70 years to be found, but Sarah had been waiting a lifetime to discover what she was capable of. And that discovery, that revelation of her own strength, was worth more than any vault full of currency could ever be. She turned away from the window and walked back to the twins' rooms, settling into a chair between their doorways where she could watch them both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new problems to solve. There would be lawyers and meetings and decisions about how to use the fortune she'd been given. There would be reporters and curiosity seekers and people who wanted something from her. But tonight, in this moment, there was only peace. Only the sound of her children breathing. Only the knowledge that they were safe, that they were loved, that they had a future. And that was everything. That was the real treasure. And that was what she'd been searching for all along without knowing it. As Sarah's eyes grew heavy and sleep began to pull at her, she whispered a promise into the quiet darkness. A promise to herself, to her children, to every parent who'd ever felt the weight of impossible circumstances pressing down on them. "We made it," she said softly. "And if we can make it, anyone can. You just have to be brave enough to keep going when everyone tells you to stop. You just have to believe you're worth fighting for, even when no one else does." The school settled around her, its old bones creaking gently. A building that had once been forgotten, now filled with life and light and purpose. Like Sarah herself, it had been dismissed, abandoned, considered worthless by everyone who'd looked at it. But underneath the decay had been solid foundations, on strong walls, and spaces waiting to be filled with love. Sometimes the things that appear most broken are simply waiting for someone brave enough to see their potential. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the person desperate enough to look. And sometimes, when you risk your last dollar on hope, you discover that hope was worth more than money could ever measure. Sarah closed her eyes and let sleep take her, surrounded by the evidence of impossible victory. A homeless woman had bought an abandoned school with her last dollar, and beneath the ruins, she'd found not just a fortune, but proof that miracles still existed for those brave enough to believe in them. The treasure wasn't in the vault. It was in the journey. It was in the survival. It was in the moment she decided her children deserved better and refused to accept anything less. And that treasure, that priceless, irreplaceable treasure, was hers forever. 6 months after the settlement finalized, Sarah stood in what had once been the school's gymnasium, now transformed into a community gathering space with soft lighting and acoustic panels that dampened sound for children with sensory sensitivities. The room was filled with parents, their children playing safely in designated quiet zones and active zones, each space carefully designed for different needs. This was the Foundation's first major fundraising gala, though calling it a gala felt wrong. Sarah had insisted on making it accessible, casual, a celebration rather than a stiff formal event. A mother approached her, a woman maybe 10 years older than Sarah, not with tired eyes that Sarah recognized instantly. That particular kind of exhaustion came from years of fighting battles most people never had to acknowledge existed. "Mrs. Mitchell?" the woman said hesitantly. "I'm Rebecca Torres. My son Daniel is 8. He's autistic, nonverbal. I've been on the waiting list for speech therapy for 3 years. The public schools say they don't have resources. Private therapy costs more than I make in a month." Her voice cracked slightly. "I saw your foundation's website. The part about free services. Is that real?" Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion she'd learned to control in public settings. "It's real. We have 3 speech therapists on staff now, working on a sliding scale based on family income. Many families pay nothing. When can Daniel start? Rebecca's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've been trying for so long. I thought maybe by the time he was 10, maybe 11, we'd finally get help. But 8? He can start now? Next week if you want, Sarah said gently. We'll do an assessment, create a plan, and get him started. No waiting list, no bureaucracy, just help. Rebecca pulled Sarah into a fierce hug, her body shaking with sobs of relief. Sarah held her, remembering every moment she'd stood in this woman's shoes, every rejection, every closed door, every person who'd looked at her struggling children and offered pity instead of assistance. When Rebecca finally pulled away, she whispered, "How did you know? How did you know exactly what we needed?" Sarah smiled sadly. Because 15 months ago, I was you. I was sleeping in a van with my twins, getting turned away from every service, every program, every opportunity. The only difference between us is luck, impossible, ridiculous luck. And I decided that luck shouldn't be the thing that determines which children get help. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Sarah found Brennan helping the cleanup crew stack chairs. He'd become more than a friend in the months since the discovery. He'd become family, the kind you choose rather than the kind forced on you by biology. His daughter Michelle, now 24, worked at the foundation as a program coordinator. Her unique perspective as an autistic adult, invaluable in designing services that actually helped rather than simply managing symptoms. You did good tonight, Brennan said, settling into a folding chair with a tired grunt. Raised almost $200,000. That'll fund the art therapy program for a year, maybe more. Sarah sat beside him, pulling off the heels she'd worn for the event, and sighing with relief as her feet touched the cool floor. Rebecca Torres broke me tonight. Did you see her son? Beautiful kid, smart eyes. And he's been waiting 3 years for basic services. 3 years, David. What kind of system makes a child wait 3 years? A broken one, Brennan said quietly. The same system that would have let you and your kids slip through the cracks if you hadn't found that vault. That's what keeps me up at night, Sarah admitted. What about all the families who don't find vaults full of money? What happens to them? Some of them find their way here now, Brennan pointed out. You can't save everyone, Sarah, but you're saving the ones you can reach. That matters. The gymnasium doors opened, and Patricia Chen entered, still wearing her courtroom attire from earlier that day. She'd become Sarah's attorney permanently, handling the foundation's legal work and fighting small battles against bureaucracies that tried to limit what the organization could do. We won, Chen announced, setting her briefcase down with a satisfied thud. Judge ruled in our favor. The county has to grant us the permit to open the residential program. Sarah stood so quickly her chair nearly tipped backward. Seriously? They approved it. Reluctantly, but yes. Starting next month, you can begin accepting families for the residential component. Up to 12 families at a time can live here while their children receive intensive services. The residential program had been Sarah's dream from the beginning. The school was massive, with space to convert the second floor into apartment-style units where families could live temporarily, free of charge, while their children received therapy, education, and support. For families like Sarah had been, living in cars or shelters or overcrowded relatives' homes, it would be transformative. 12 families, Sarah breathed. That's 40, maybe 50 people. Kids who'll have beds and safety and consistency. And parents who'll have time to breathe, Brennan added. Time to figure out next steps without drowning in immediate crisis. Sarah thought of the van, of the endless nights of broken sleep, of the constant fear that someone would knock on the window and force them to move again. She thought of Emma's silence and Ethan's distress, both made worse by instability and exhaustion. If even one family could be spared that experience, the entire fight would be worth it. Over the next 3 months, the residential program launched with its first 4 families. Sarah interviewed each one personally, listening to stories that echoed her own with heartbreaking consistency. A father whose wife had left when their daughter's autism diagnosis came through, unable to handle the stress. A grandmother raising twin grandsons with severe ADHD after their parents died in a car accident. A young couple, barely 25, with a 4-year-old son who'd been expelled from 3 daycares for behavioral issues related to undiagnosed sensory processing disorder. Each family moved into the renovated second-floor apartments with the same expression of disbelief Rebecca Torres had worn. The apartments were simple but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and bathrooms designed for accessibility. The foundation provided furniture, basic supplies, and a weekly stipend for groceries. In exchange, families committed to engaging with the services offered, participating in parent support groups, and contributing to the community in whatever ways they could. The transformation happened quickly. Children who'd been in crisis began to stabilize within weeks. Parents who'd been operating in survival mode started sleeping through the night, started smiling again, and started believing in futures they'd thought were impossible. Sarah made it a point to have dinner with the residential families once a week, gathering everyone in the communal dining room for potluck meals where conversation flowed easily and children could be themselves without judgment. During one of these dinners, about 2 months into the program, a father named Marcus Johnson stood up and cleared his throat nervously. "I want to say something," he announced, his voice shaking slightly. "Before we came here, I was planning to give up custody of my son. Not because I don't love him, because I couldn't give him what he needed. I was failing him every day, and I thought maybe the state could do better." He paused, blinking back tears. But being here, seeing him happy, watching him make progress with the therapists, and seeing him play with other kids who understand him, I realized I wasn't failing. The system was failing us. And you, Mrs. Mitchell, you built something that actually works. You saved my family. The room erupted in applause, but Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She understood Marcus's pain intimately. That particular agony of loving your child desperately while feeling completely inadequate to meet their needs. She'd come so close to believing Karen's cruel suggestion that Emma and Ethan would be better off without her. So terrifyingly close. Emma, now speaking more consistently, tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mama, why are you crying?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Happy tears, baby. Because we're helping people. Because families are staying together. Because kids like you and Ethan are getting to be exactly who they are, and people are celebrating them instead of trying to fix them." That night, after the twins fell asleep, Sarah walked through the school's quiet hallways, visiting spaces that had transformed so completely she sometimes forgot their original purpose. The old cafeteria was now a sensory gym with swings, climbing walls, and soft play areas. The library had become a reading room with noise-canceling headphones and fidget tools at every station. The former teacher's lounge was a parent resource center with comfortable seating, free coffee, and walls covered in helpful information without the condescension that usually accompanied such materials. She found herself standing outside the boiler room, the entrance to the vault still concealed behind a locked door. She rarely went down there anymore. The money was gone. Ira transferred to secure accounts managed by financial advisors who ensured the foundation would exist long after Sarah was gone. But sometimes she felt drawn to the space, to the place where everything had changed. She unlocked the door and descended the familiar stairs, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The vault stood open and empty now, its shelves bare, the boxes long since catalogued and processed. But the space still held a certain weight, a presence that felt almost sacred. Sarah sat on the concrete floor where she'd once collapsed in shock, running her hands over the cold stone. She thought about the people who'd hidden this money here 70 years ago, about their fear and uncertainty during the Great Depression, about their hope that this emergency reserve would save someone someday. "You did," she whispered into the empty vault. "You saved us, and we're using it to save others. I hope that's what you wanted. I hope you'd be proud." The vault didn't answer, but Sarah felt a peace settle over her nonetheless. The money had served its purpose. It had rescued her family from desperation and given her the resources to help others. The discovery had been a miracle, but the real miracle was what came after. The choice to use unimaginable wealth, not for luxury or comfort, but for service and healing. 3 months later, the foundation celebrated its first anniversary. The event was smaller than the gala, just staff and residential families, and a few key supporters. Brennan gave a speech about Sarah's courage. Patricia Chen presented legal victories the foundation had won on behalf of families. Michelle Brennan, when speaking with the careful precision common to autistic adults, described programs she'd designed based on her own experiences navigating a world not built for her neurology. But the moment that mattered most came when Emma and Ethan stood together at the front of the room, Emma holding a microphone with trembling hands, while Ethan stood beside her, rocking gently but present, engaged in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. "My name is Emma Mitchell," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A year ago, my mom and brother and me lived in a van. We were homeless. People were mean to us. They said my mom couldn't take care of us because Ethan and me are different." She paused, gathering courage. "But my mom never gave up. She bought this school when everyone laughed at her, and she found money that changed our lives. But she didn't keep it just for us. She built this place so other families wouldn't have to be scared and alone like we were." Emma looked at Sarah, her eyes shining with tears. "My mom is the bravest person I know, and I want to be brave like her when I grow up." The room erupted in applause, but Sarah could barely see through her tears. She pulled both twins into her arms, holding them tight, while Ethan hummed contentedly, and Emma whispered, "Did I do good, Mama?" "You did perfect, baby," Sarah managed to say. "You're both perfect." Later, as the celebration wound down and families retreated to their apartments, Sarah found a moment alone on the front steps, where she'd sat so many times during this incredible journey. The playground glowed under new lighting she'd had installed, allowing children to play safely even after dark. She could hear laughter from inside, the sounds of community and connection. Headlights appeared in the driveway, and Sarah tensed instinctively before recognizing the car. It was Karen, her sister, whom she hadn't seen in person since before the discovery. Karen had called several times, apologizing, asking to reconnect, but Sarah had kept her at a distance, unsure whether forgiveness was something she was ready to offer. Karen stepped out of the car slowly, looking uncertain in a way Sarah had never seen her. She approached the steps cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "I know I don't have the right to be here," Karen said quietly. "But I saw Emma's speech. Someone posted a video online. And I needed to tell you in person how sorry I am, how wrong I was, about everything." Sarah studied her sister, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. "You told me to give up my children. I know, and I'll regret those words for the rest of my life." Karen's voice broke. "I was cruel. I was judgmental. I thought I knew better, but I didn't know anything. I didn't understand what you were going through, what the twins needed. I didn't understand that love and determination could overcome obstacles I thought were insurmountable. "So what changed?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "I watched that video of Emma. I listened to her talk about being scared and alone, and I realized that could have been prevented. If I'd helped you, if I'd offered support instead of criticism, you wouldn't have been homeless. The twins wouldn't have suffered. I failed you when you needed me most." Sarah felt tears gathering but refused to let them fall. "Well, so I needed you, Karen. I needed family. And you abandoned me. I know. And I can't fix that. But I want to try to be better. To be the aunt Emma and Ethan deserve." Karen took a tentative step closer. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance." Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, weighing pain against possibility. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect herself and her children from further hurt. But another part, the part that had built this foundation on the principle of second chances, knew that healing required risk. "The twins are asleep," she said finally. "But you can come to dinner next week. Meet them properly. Not as the aunt who rejected them, but as someone who wants to be part of their lives. If you're serious about that." Karen's face crumpled with relief. "I'm serious. I promise, Sarah. I'll do better." As Karen's car pulled away, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not complete forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The understanding that people could grow, could change, could become better than they'd been. She'd changed, after all. She'd transformed from a desperate woman sleeping in a van into someone who could offer hope to others. If she could change that dramatically, perhaps Karen could too. The foundation continued to grow. By the end of the second year, they were serving over 200 families directly, and countless more through outreach programs, advocacy work, and free resources distributed online. The residential program expanded to accommodate 16 families. They added music therapy, equine therapy, art therapy. They hired more specialists, built more programs, reached more children. But Sarah never forgot where it started. She kept a small reminder in her office, a single $1 bill framed on the wall. Not one of the valuable bills from the vault, but the actual dollar she'd used to buy the school at auction. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Sometimes your last dollar is the first step toward everything." On slow days, when paperwork overwhelmed her or challenges seemed insurmountable, she'd look at that dollar and remember the woman who'd walked into the courthouse with nothing but hope and desperation. She'd remember the moment she'd raised her hand to bid, the feeling of every eye in the room judging her, the certainty that she was making a foolish choice. She'd been right about one thing. It had been foolish. Foolish to buy a condemned building with money she couldn't afford to lose. Foolish to hope that something good could come from something so broken. Foolish to believe that a woman with nothing could provide for children with everything stacked against them. But sometimes, foolish choices led to miracles. Sometimes, desperate gambles paid off in ways you couldn't imagine. And sometimes, the thing everyone mocked you for became the thing that saved not just you, but countless others. Emma and Ethan thrived beyond Sarah's wildest dreams. Emma discovered a love for poetry, her carefully chosen words creating beauty from the silence she'd once lived in. Ethan found music, his mathematical mind, understanding rhythms and patterns in ways that astounded his teachers. They made friends, real friends who accepted their differences and celebrated their unique perspectives. And Sarah? And Sarah discovered that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, even millions of them. It was measured in families kept together, in children given chances they'd been denied, in parents who could finally breathe, finally hope, finally believe their children would be okay. The homeless single mother who'd bought a broken school with her last dollar had built something that would outlast her, something that would continue helping families long after she was gone. The money from the vault had made it possible, but it was Sarah's heart, her determination, her refusal to forget where she'd come from, that made it real. As she turned off the lights in her office and headed upstairs to the apartment she shared with her children, Sarah paused at the window overlooking the playground, and children who would have been turned away from other programs played there every day. Families who would have been broken by a system that didn't understand them found refuge in these walls. And it all started with $1 and one woman brave enough, desperate enough, foolish enough to bet everything on hope. That, Sarah thought as she climbed the stairs to tuck her sleeping children in one more time, was the real treasure. Not the money in the vault, but the lives changed because of what that money became in hands that knew what poverty felt like, what rejection tasted like, what it meant to be dismissed by a world that didn't see your worth. She'd been invisible once, she and her children, overlooked, abandoned, forgotten. But from that invisibility, she'd built something impossible to ignore, a place where being different wasn't a deficit, but a gift, where struggling wasn't shameful but human, where help came without judgment and support arrived without conditions. The vault was empty now, but the school had never been fuller. And that perfect paradox, that beautiful irony, made Sarah smile every single day. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.